Hi, I'm Mr. Wahlberg, and I'm glad you're here. Stymied by the voices of protest, as well as thwarted by the Supreme Court, Roosevelt turned to a second New Deal, which focused on economic security. Turn with us now to those thrilling days of yesteryear, when out of the past come the thundering hoofbeats of Wahlberg's A-Push. History class rides again! We have 4 objectives today. By the end of this class, you should be able to identify the main proponents of economic justice in the 1930s and explain the measures that they advocated. You should be able to examine imagine the major initiatives of the Second New Deal and analyze the way they differed from the First New Deal. You should be able to assess the ways in which the New Deal recast the meaning of American freedom, and you should be able to identify significant entertainers and entertainment of the 1930s. But let's begin in Roman numeral number 8. Here I want to talk about the grassroots revolt and the voices of protest of the 1930s. And here, let's talk about labor's great upheaval, because Roosevelt's election as president did a lot to rekindle the hopes of labor, which had seemed like they had been dashed in the roaring 20s as the big business and the major powers took over the economy. The little guys seemed to kind of get pushed aside. But workers were given legal protections under the Roosevelt administration that allowed them to organize unions to go argue for their rights. The result was the huge increases in the number of labor unions and then the labor unions membership, and then huge protests that came as a result from it. Take the instance of 1934. There was 2,000 strikes nationwide. Today, strikes are exceedingly rare. There's other ways that unions try to negotiate for better conditions or better pay. But to imagine 2,000 of them in a year, that's a huge number. The labor union upheaval in the early 1930s, it did propose a challenge to the American Federation of Labor. The AFL had organized workers by trade, so the welders or machine mechanics, rather than unite all of the workers in an industry, say like steel manufacturing. A lot of unions said, a lot of these individual unions could really join together and have a single focus. Take car manufacturing. Well, car manufacturing involves welders and painters and machinists and, all kinds of different unions, which should all have parts of the job, but they're all in different unions, even though they're all in similar working conditions. And some union leaders wanted to unite the various unions within like an industry. Well, the AFL refused to do that. A guy named John Lewis. John Lewis was the head of the mine workers. He led a walkout of the AFL, and it produced a new labor organization known as the Congress of Industrial Organizations, the CIO. And the United Auto Workers, which was part of the CIO, led a sit-down strike in 1936. The sit-down strike of 1936 is really a pretty famous one, and you'll want to get these details because it was surprisingly effective. Rather than walking out of the factory, which was pretty typical of the way that unions negotiated, and then let scabs take their jobs. They've left, so the manufacturing owners, the owners of the plant would just go hire other people to go take their jobs. Those people known as scabs. In that case, but in 1936, in the sit-down strike, they actually just stayed in the factory, and then that halted all of the work, and it forced confrontation. The UAW strike spread to factories across the state of Michigan, and it even broke the will of Henry Ford, who would finally allow unions in his Ford factories. By 1940, union membership had reached 9 million members. The labor upsurge altered the balance of economic power, and it propelled the forefront labor politics goals of a freer and a fairer and a more equal America. CIO leaders explain that the Depression, with its, as a result, CIO leaders explain the Depression came about as a result of an imbalance of wealth and income. So that's, they were saying that it was these conditions which led to the Great Depression. And in subpoint B, I want to introduce you to one of the biggest critics of Roosevelt in its time, then governor of Louisiana, a guy named Huey Long. Long had proposed capping. Long is a radical. He's an economic radical in a lot of different ways. And he's a fascinating figure. In Louisiana history, people circle this guy as this is one of those really standout guys. Long had proposed a national cap on any personal fortunes. Whenever somebody had earned, $50 million, he said, roughly today would be like $600 million today. But at that point, basically that was as much as any American, according to the Long plan, should be allowed to have. And anything over than that would be subject to a restructured progressive federal tax code that would basically just tax all of that at 100%, anything over that. And the resulting revenue, like all of that money coming into the federal government then, would be doled out through government benefits and public works. Now, Long in his early days was like an advocate for Roosevelt. He was a big champion and supporter of Roosevelt's reforms. But he turned on the president and actually tried to begin running to Roosevelt's left, really kind of be a more leftist approach. He disliked the rich. Huey Long disliked banks. His motto was every man a king. He didn't like the idea of wealth and stuff being concentrated in son. He said everybody should be rich, everybody should be a king. And Long, when he was governor of Louisiana, argued for expanded schools and hospitals and highways and bridge construction. He set up a system of charity hospitals for the poor and free textbooks for school children. Huey Long, like I said, is still a controversial figure in Louisiana history. One part demagogue, one part, aspiring dictator. He was a populist. He's, really a lightning rod figure and a transformative figure, but was absolutely a challenging figure to Roosevelt. And probably Long was mounting a campaign to go challenge Roosevelt for president. But before he could become a serious threat to the Roosevelt in the presidency, he was assassinated. He was shot and killed in 1935 by a physician named Dr. Weiss. Huey Long also had bodyguards. He was a controversial guy. He's one of those people that always felt like he needed protection. When Long was assassinated by Weiss, Huey Long's bodyguards went and then shot Weiss and really shot the snot out of him, shot him 62 times, forever encircling Huey Long in this, conspiracy theorists love this kind of story, right? Like the guy that was going to run against Roosevelt was assassinated, and then before he got a chance to go witness, he was assassinated by Long's own bodyguards, and was it covering up the evidence? And none of that's going to be on your test, but it's one of those that conspiracy theorists just love to dream about. Subpoint C. In Subpoint C, I want to introduce you to yet a different critic in a different lane. This guy was Charles Coughlin, and he was Father Charles Coughlin. He was a Roman Catholic priest, and he was a controversial guy. He actually became a radio broadcaster as a way originally of raising funds and an appeal to his church, and then the people on the radio encouraged him to say, "You have a really great voice, and you could, you have a strong position that you could go advocate for things," and encouraged him to move out of theological topics into political topics. And Father Coughlin really just that's what kind of made his career. He had an astonishing listeners, 30 million listeners, and that's. Today that would be one of the great radio broadcasters of our era. It was absolutely dominant in the 1930s. He was, kind of like an ally of Huey Long, although in a different way. Father Coughlin started out as an ardent fan of Roosevelt, just like Huey Long did, but then turned hard against him in 1934 into a different approach. Rather, Huey Long was kind of a leftist socialist, kind of like an economic radical that way. Father Charles Coughlin was, on the other hand, stronger, right-wing, turned almost like a fascist advocate. He formed the Union for Social Justice, and the National Union for Social Justice. He called for nationalizing major industries and railroads. The government would just take over types of industries. Also the protection of the rights of labor. Father Coughlin had a really anti-banker attitude. He really just didn't like the economic system, like the banking system. And he hinted that he, in particular, didn't like Jewish bankers. And this is kind of where Coughlin goes from political radical to just controversial, dicey person. He began to support a lot of Hitler's and Mussolini's ideas under the slogan of social justice. Primarily, he talked about politics and economics. He talked very little about religion, particularly after that first phase of his radio career. The Vatican wanted him out, wanted him silenced, said this is just not what a Catholic priest should be doing, but really powerless to do anything about it. It actually took Roosevelt himself to get the radio show canceled when war broke out in 1939, when it was seen as dangerous and seditious speech. Subpoint D. Here I want to introduce you to yet another critic of Roosevelt, kind of in this grassroots sense of criticism of it, and this is Dr. Francis Townsend. And he, doesn't take the same approach as Huey Long, trying to run against him in politics. He doesn't take the same approach as Father Charles Coughlin, going and advocating for a fascist approach for it. Townsend is an economic radical specifically for the elderly, and we consider Townsend to be maybe the father of Social Security, although our modern Social Security system really isn't the way that Townsend would have conceived it. But he was an enthusiastic promoter of Franklin Roosevelt. He admired Roosevelt's Social Security program, but he felt the elderly deserved twice as much as they received from any New Deal programs, and basically said that we need to cushion the elderly with a huge amount of money, and then that would get them out of the workplace so old people don't have to go work anymore, and then younger people like adults could go take take their jobs, and then like there would be money to go pass on a thing. But basically he says the federal government should just go dump money into the elderly, and then it can go move down from there. And when Roosevelt didn't do that, Roosevelt really, while he was a kind-hearted person and cared for people, Roosevelt just really didn't like the idea of dumping money into anything. So that eventually Townsend broke away from the FDR camp and became a loud critic of him for just not going far enough. Perhaps the most interesting critic of the Roosevelt administration was his own wife and subappointee of Eleanor Roosevelt. Now, Eleanor Roosevelt is a fascinating figure and way more than what we're going to get into the scope of this class, but she's one of my favorite Americans in the transformative way that she would approach the role of the First Lady, the role of women, the power of individuals advocating. She's really a fascinating person, but she transformed the role of the First Lady, and I think that's where we best remember her role. It turned the job into from presidential hostess to really a political action job. She traveled widely. She spoke to a lot of groups. She often voiced her personal opinions that was maybe to the left of the president. She was somewhat more radical than Roosevelt was. She authored a weekly newspaper column, and she hosted a radio show. When she traveled the country, she talked to every kind of person. In a lot of ways, she was Franklin's eyes and ears. Franklin himself, of course, crippled by polio. He couldn't get out and travel the country very well, but Eleanor could. And so, she really would be his advocate abroad. Now, of course, their marriage wasn't a real happy marriage, and it was more of a business and political arrangement. Take, for instance, the fact that they didn't share a bedroom. But so she would go out meeting with people. Roosevelt would go to bed. She would take little notes and slip him under his bedroom door, telling him what she thought needed to be done and trying to inform his agenda. She and Roosevelt shared basically all of the same goals, but Eleanor wanted him to get there a lot faster. She was deeply concerned with helping every person, no matter how neglected, and it was in a lot of ways sort of the heart of Franklin Roosevelt's administration. But while Eleanor Roosevelt was a pillar of feminist success, organized feminism had really been in a disarray since the 1920s, and it really had ended as a political force. Essentially, when women got the right to vote in the 1920s, all of the women's movements sort of fell apart. Having achieved the goal that was holding them all together, there wasn't much to hold them all together. And Eleanor became an important figure, but not a figure leading a unified force. Most New Deal policies, most New Deal programs really didn't include women in them. The ideal of a male-headed household, it was powerfully shaping social policy. In a lot of ways, the New Deal programs were extended kind of only to men and then to women through their husbands along the way. And that brings us to Roman numeral number 9. Here I want to talk about a second New Deal. When Roosevelt's policies initially appeared to be kind of a failure at solving the problems of the Great Depression, at pulling the country out of the Depression, and by Roosevelt responding to the popular clamor for greater economic equality, in 1935, Roosevelt launched what he would refer to as his second New Deal. And here the emphasis became economic security. It focused on some real target audiences, and I was really the characterization difference of the New Deal. That it wasn't just the shotgun approach of trying to, change the whole economy. It was really trying to more of the rifle approach of picking off some particular issues. Things about farmers and labor unions and the Democratic State Party organizations and city machines and blue-collar workers and racial minorities, ethnic minorities, religious minorities, and farmers and white Southerners and people that were on welfare relief and intellectuals. And kind of all together, we begin to think of them collectively as the New Deal Coalition. And it became a bloc of loyal Democratic voters really until 1968, when there was a significant political realignment. Besides defining its supporters, Roosevelt also portrayed the rich as his political and economic opponents. He labeled them the economic royalists and the enemy within our gates in his Rendezvous with Destiny speech at the nomination acceptance speech in the 1936 Democratic National Convention. And all of this became kind of the flavor of the second New Deal. And of these, sometimes historians talk about the alphabet soup of the New Deal. Let's talk about these with the WPA, the Works Progress Administration. It was a very large program that was a workfare program. It's not specifically a welfare program. Roosevelt doesn't have a lot of interest in just handing out cash as welfare, but he does have a lot of interest in supporting people that are willing to work for it. And I think that's really the backbone of the WPA, where 3 million men from really every walk of life worked for a decade on building projects across the country. And it was directed by a person named Harry Hopkins, who changed the physical face of the United States. Public buildings and bridges and 500,000 miles of roads and 600 airports and stadiums and swimming pools and sewage treatment plants. It employed white-collar workers and lawyers and doctors and dentists, and everybody was part of the WPA. Perhaps the most famous WPA projects were actually in the arts, where murals and theater performances and academic works of history and anthropology and dance programs and orchestras and choral groups would all also be part of the WPA's work. Subpoint C. I think really the most enduring piece of the Second New Deal, though, is in Social Security. It was the centerpiece of the Second New Deal. Where it's a retirement insurance system to provide money to people over the age of 65. And today the age of 65 or 60 or 63 or 67, or by the time I'm ready to retire, maybe it's 167. Who knows? But that number has changed. But always the emphasis has been as kind of people were of the retirement age to allow them in a small way, at least to supplement their own savings to go retire. And it's an interesting system, Social Security. People pay into it. So like I'm of working age and I have a job as a high school history teacher in a Catholic high school, and I'm paying into Social Security. My employer also pays into Social Security. They pay as much as I do, which means that the gazillions of dollars I earn as a school teacher in a religious school is actually costs more for the school to employ me, because they also have to pay into Social Security with there also. But while I am working, there is not a pot of money in Washington, D.C. that says, Mr. Wahlberg, this is his cash that Social Security is paying into. It's that money is immediately spent to people that are retired now. People pay into the system while they're young, because I'm young, and working, and then collect the benefits when they retire. Now, at the time, there was 16 workers for every one retiree. That has changed. Now we're closer to like 2 to 1, and there's not as many workers for all the retirees out there. And the first people to receive Social Security benefits actually never paid anything into it at all. It was always meant to be a supplement, and I think this is one thing that people often miss in Social Security. Social Security payments were meant to be a supplement to your own individual savings or pension or retirement plans, not something to live on. And truly, if a person wanted to live on Social Security, there's not quite enough there to go live on. The Social Security, Frances Perkins, the Secretary of Labor, she wanted the states to go run Social Security and have workers to go pay for it themselves. But Roosevelt said that there really needed to be a federal program to fund Social Security by taxes on employers and on workers together, believing that if the program was funded by taxes, then it would make the program secure and irrevocable. There was no way to cut Social Security, and this is probably still true today. Social Security is often referred to as the third rail of politics. That phrase is kind of lost on us Midwesterners that aren't around subways. But subways, it's a train. They run on 2 tracks, and there's a third track that goes and carries all the electrical charge that drives that train forward. And if you touch it, you'll die. Kind of the thinking of Social Security works that way. That no politician can go touch that third rail because it'll just kill them in Social Security. In the polls. So it emerges as this hybrid of national and local funding and control and eligibility standards, and it's a dramatic departure from traditional functions of government because it wraps up the government in all kinds of just everyday life for people. I think Social Security will be around forever. I could be wrong, I'm bad at predicting the future, but it just doesn't seem the kind of thing to me that will ever really go away, although its function, its change, its eligibility certainly might. Roman numeral number 10. Here I want to talk about how all of these things tie in with the sense of American freedom. It's a very Dr. Foner topic with a reckoning with liberty. Subpoint A. FDR was a master of the modern media. Presidents often are in their time that just really understand how to control the way that the media approaches. You take, Thomas Jefferson, who was such a brilliant writer and was such a poetic writer, was a master of the medium of his day. Or you imagine Harding. Harding was a newspaper man and understood what it meant to reach people in a modern sense of communication. Or you take William Jennings Bryan and the whistle stop campaigns. It really transformed the way that he speaks to people. And then when you get to Roosevelt, the new technology, new way that people talked was the radio. And Roosevelt was better at it than anybody. Also, the movie house newsreel was great, but Roosevelt just had this sense of communication, a way to talk to people. Roosevelt was born rich, grew up in the upper crust. When he becomes an economic popular, he is what the historian H.W. Brands considered a traitor to his class. But he could speak to just normal people, people down on their luck. He just had a way of connecting to the average person that people would tune in their radios and feel like they were listening to the president talking to them in particular. His language was simple and direct and intimate, and it really connected with Americans on a personal level. Maybe the other comparisons, that Lincoln was a great rhetorician of his era. Teddy Roosevelt, a master of the media in his own era and the bully pulpit. Not unlike the way that JFK was a master of television, or Reagan himself a master of television, or Clinton in theirs, or Donald Trump in our era. You compare Roosevelt and his ease on the radio with Hoover, who struck people as kind of stiff and kind of an awkward engineer. Subpoint B. In 1936, there's a presidential election which focuses on the question of the ideal of freedom as the central issue of that 36 campaign. The Republican Party chose Kansas Governor Alf Landon, who was a former Theodore Roosevelt-style progressive. Landon opposed Social Security. He called it and the other New Deal programs as a real threat to individual freedom. In 1936, though, there was no successful challenger who could ever get over Franklin Delano Roosevelt, because Roosevelt won in a landslide. It was an absolute crushing, with Franklin Delano Roosevelt earning 60.8% of the popular vote to Landon's just a little over 35%, and won 46-2 in a really lopsided victory. For 30 years, Alf Landon was on the Kansas high school assessments for social studies, so the Kansas high school students could know about their own presidential challenger. And I always thought, why would you need to know about a guy that got clobbered in the polls? Subpoint C. Now, the Supreme Court of the United States was also pretty eagerly overturning so much of Roosevelt's New Deal policies and declared the centerpiece of the enforcing bureaucracy, the NRA, the National Recovery Administration, declared it to be unconstitutional. And so Roosevelt in 1937, which was after the 36 election, but in 1937, Roosevelt responded with what was referred to as the court packing plan, where he wanted to add 7 new justices to the United States Supreme Court. And that way, he thought that the court would go vote in favor of all of his ideas. Essentially, the Supreme Court was overturning so much of the New Deal programs. The Constitution doesn't specify how many Supreme Court justices there should be. There's 9, but only by tradition is there 9. There could be 3, there could be 7, there could be 9, there could be 109, and it would be totally constitutional to do so. And so he thought that was maybe the way to go get his policies through the Supreme Court. This alarmed Americans, though. People saw it as an effort to subvert or even destroy the Constitution. And that would give Roosevelt control of 2 of the 3 branches of government. The plan also raised cries that the president was an aspiring dictator and was roundly rejected. In 1937, though, the Supreme Court seemed to be more willing to accept the New Deal programs. It turned aside challenges to Social Security and to the Wagner Act, which was the law protecting unions. The court's new willingness to accept the New Deal marked a permanent change in judicial policy that came about just kind of through some natural vacancies, a couple of retirements, a couple of deaths, and suddenly the Supreme Court looks a whole lot different in a pretty short period of time without Roosevelt ever having to turn to his court-packing plan. Subpoint D. The Fair Labor Standards Bill banned any goods produced by child labor from interstate commerce. This bill also set 40 cents as the minimum hourly wage, and it required overtime pay for anybody working exceeding 40 hours per week. The Fair Labor Standards Bill would become really kind of the new way that workers would be approached in the country. The economist John Maynard Keynes, in his book, which is now famous, and it's more interesting than it sounds, The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money, a 1936 book, called for deep deficit spending to go spur economic growth. And this was really the transformative piece for the Roosevelt's economic plan, a shift from relief of trying to get people, just some like break from their woes of welfare and workfare into absolute economic growth. And then in 1937, the economy seemed to backfire on him and took a sharp downturn, as maybe referred to as the Depression within the Depression, where 2 million people lost their jobs and unemployment jumped from 14.3% to 19% by 1938. And people ended up living back in shanty towns again. These still called Hoovervilles, they might as well have been called Rooseveltvilles if it wasn't kind of so cumbersome to say so. And then a period of political stalemate followed with the congressional election of 1938. Republicans were picking up seats in Congress even while Democrats were holding, two branches of the government. And they often teamed up with Democrats from the South who were kind of dispirited with Roosevelt's approaches to go stop FDR. It's not unusual in a midterm election. The party in the White House would lose seats in Congress. So here you have a Democrat in the White House and the Republicans are picking up seats in Congress. That's not an unusual pattern in any kind of political system. Roosevelt concluded, though, that the enactment of any future New Deal policies would require a liberalization of the Southern Democratic Party so that they wouldn't be constantly turning against him to join up with Republicans along the way. But let's shift gears in Roman numeral number 11 to talk about what's popular life like in the 1930s. Here we run the gamut in a lot of different ways. First thing I want to talk about are movies, who were really hitting their stride as a type of artistic venue and entertainment of the era. Wacky comedies, lavish musicals, love stories, and gangster films were all vying for the attention of the movie-going public in the New Deal years. Following the end of the silent film era and the rise of talking pictures, new stars emerged, such as Clark Gable and Marlene Dietrich and James Cagney. They came out of Hollywood, which was the center of the film industry. These stars helped launch a new era of Hollywood glamour. This time is sometimes known as a golden era in American cinematic history because it really was such a glamorous approach. Some films made during the 1930s offered pure escape from the hard realities of the time, with visions of wealth and romance and good times. The most famous film of the era, and really truly one of the most popular films of all time, was Gone with the Wind in 1939. Today, if you were to take the sales of tickets from Gone with the Wind and adjust it for inflation, it is still the most popular movie in American cinematic history. 1939 was also the release of The Wizard of Oz, which was a remake of a 1925 silent film. Wizard was the most impressive and successful use of Technicolor, a style of film processing, and I think, for my money, it still endures today. When you watch Wizard of Oz, the storyline holds up, the sound recording, while it's been remastered, still holds up, the color is as striking as ever. Wizard of Oz was a masterpiece of 1939 and a masterpiece of any era. In 1937, just a couple of years before, Walt Disney, who, in my opinion, is maybe the single greatest filmmaker ever. In 1937, Walt Disney introduced Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. It was the first feature-length animated movie. There had been animated movies before, but they were all film shorts. They were small pieces of storytelling. Not to go tell an extended feature-length movie, Snow White was unique in that respect, and it was great. Walt Disney was a creative genius. He was a hard worker, and he was really determined to go make realistic and technologically superior movies in what's truly an artificial medium. When you watch Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs today, you can see that it's a product of 1937. Animation technology has just changed so much, but the storytelling still holds up, and Snow White still holds an important place in the pantheon of the Disney princesses. But I want to talk about maybe my favorite group of the 30s, and that's the Marx Brothers. Comedies were all the rage. Comedies really never go out of style, but the Marx Brothers, they were so good. 1931's A Duck Soup, or 1935's Night at the Opera, which I think is their best. It starred the Marx Brothers, who were initially a comedy act in the vaudeville era, so like performing on stage. And then they made their jump to radio, and then made their jump to film from there. Between 1905 to 1949, like 45 years of acting and movie making, it was a national sensation during the Depression. They were actual brothers as a comedy troupe, and man, they're great. Americans also flocked to see gangster films that presented the images of dark and gritty streets and looming skyscrapers of urban America. Gangster movies were kind of what superhero movies in our day today. It's the exciting movie that everybody's got to see. That's the gangster movies of the 30s. They, featured hard-bitten characters struggling to succeed in a harsh environment where they faced the same kind of difficulties that Depression-era audiences could understand well. Even if the audience couldn't relate to a life of crime, they could understand the feeling of being kicked around and up against it all. Some commentators believed that several films, such as Mr. Deeds Goes to Town in 1936 by Frank Capra, they presented social and political accomplishments of the New Deal in a positive light. While for all of the gritty tension and anger, there's also a feeling that are we doing the right thing? And there's some of the uplifting movies of the 30s really do that also, that portrayed honest and kind-hearted people winning out over those with greedy special interests. Subpoint B. Here I want to talk about kind of the music of the 30s. Music of the 30s is an interesting time, genre-ly, not a word, but basically sometimes in music you have hard categories like this is the country sound, this is an alternative sound, this is a metal sound. And then sometimes the things kind of get fluid and people cross between genres pretty easily. And that's the 30s. Pop music, country music, show tunes, they're all these kind of fluid categories. And a lot of stars crossed over pretty easily in a handful of different ways. Fred Astaire, Gene Autry, and Bing Crosby and Ethel Waters could pop up in a variety of places, in a variety of venues, and they would seem natural in so many of them. In the 1930s, big bands and swing music was popular. By Duke Ellington and Benny Goodman and Glenn Miller and Artie Shaw, popular band leaders really making the sound of swing jazz. And it's when people listen to jazz today, it's kind of like one of the major pieces in American musical history. But in particular, I want to talk about a musical artist named Woody Guthrie, who is one of my favorites in the American catalog, because Woody Guthrie was truly a voice of the people. Experiencing the first-hand tragedies of the Depression, singer and songwriter Woody Guthrie used music to really capture the hardships of America. Along with thousands of people who were forced by the Dust Bowl to go seek a better life, Woody Guthrie traveled the country in search of brighter opportunities and told of those troubles in his songs. Woody Guthrie wrote songs about the plight of Americans during the Depression. His honest lyrics appealed to those who would suffer similar hardships, and it just finally felt like this is a guy that has lived this. Subpoint C. I'd mentioned earlier in this lecture that Franklin Roosevelt was a master of the media of his day, and in particular of radio, and that really was the dominant media. Even more than movies, radio embodied the democratic spirit of the time. Families would spend several hours a day gathered around the family radio, listening to their favorite programs. President Roosevelt deftly chose radio to be the medium for his fireside chats because it was the most direct way of reaching the American people. Like movies, radio programs offered a range of entertainment. Today, when you listen to radio, terrestrial radio isn't a huge, piece of our, listening media today. We're kind of digital these days, Spotify and, Apple Music and all those pieces. But if you, turn over and hit that FM dial and see what's on the radio, it's mostly just music. There's kind of some talk here and there, but that's pretty much the dominant of what you find in radio. But it wasn't always like that. Like movies, there was a range of entertainment. In the evening, radio networks offered excellent dramas and variety programs. Maybe the most skilled of these were produced by a guy named Orson Welles, who was an actor, a director, a producer, and a writer. He created one of the most renowned radio broadcasts of all time, still famous to this day, known as War of the Worlds, where he imagined aliens coming back to the United States. It was kind of confusing to listeners who sometimes got kind of mixed up in the storyline or came in late and thought it was actually aliens invading. It launched Orson Welles' career. He was also the movie classic director of Citizen Kane and Touch of Evil, and Orson Welles would stay relevant in filmmaking, through the 70s. After making their reputations in radio, Bob Hope and Jack Benny and the comedy duo Burns and Allen, they moved on to work in TV and movies also. But soap operas were probably the dominant thing of radio fiction programming. They were so named because they were sponsored by soap companies. They were dramas produced for homemakers, stay-at-home moms, and soap companies liked the idea of moms buying their products. They sponsored so many of these dramas. And they tended to play in the late morning and the early afternoon for homemakers, kind of when the kids weren't away. Children's programming, when the kids came home, generally aired later in the afternoon. And the most famous of these was The Lone Ranger, a radio program which would later jump to television and the movies from there. One of the first worldwide radio broadcasts described for listeners the horrific crash of Hindenburg. The Hindenburg was a German Zeppelin, an airship flying on a big inflatable hydrogen balloon. The balloon ignited upon landing in New Jersey in May of 1937, and it was covered live on the radio. There was also a film crew there, so there's kind of some spectacular film that goes down with it. But radio was the broadcast that went and reached the whole world. Subpoint D. I also want to talk about American literature of the 1930s, and this is a great decade for it. Agatha Christie was at her height in the 1930s, and she was a mystery novelist with some pieces that still get rebooted today in film and in popular culture, like Murder on the Orient Express or the ABC Murders. Agatha Christie probably is the best-selling novelist of all time. Book publishers don't keep very good records of this, so we can't say it with like numerical certainty, but she probably has somewhere around, and get this, 2 billion books in print. Nevertheless, other writers were finding hope in the positive values of American culture. The writer James Agee and the photographer Walker Evans collaborated on a book about Alabama sharecroppers called Let Us Now Praise Famous Men. It was published in 1941, but the Depression's still going on in 41, so we'll include it characteristically here. It deals with the lives of difficult, poor farmers, yet portrays their dignity and their strength of character and the people along the way. Now Let Us Praise Famous Men was an uplifting book about people working hard and trying to do the right thing. Thornton Wilder captured the beauty of small-town life in New England in 1938's play Our Town, which still endures today and is on a required reading list for most American high school students. Subpoint E. The last hard topic I want to touch on is a question of athletics and just life in the 1930s and what's kind of just like the sporting scene look like. And here there's some huge names. Take, for instance, Jesse Owens, American track and field star of the 30s, who competed in the 1936 Berlin Olympics. The story of Jesse Owens is great. He's a black man. He's competing in the Berlin Olympics in Hitler's Germany with all of the Hitler, rhetoric of racial superiority, to have an American black man show up and just blow all the Germans out of the water. Jesse Owens was fast and was a good dude too. He was easy to cheer for. People liked him, but just really embarrassed the snot out of Hitler. And you know who doesn't like that too? I want to talk for a second about baseball. Baseball is my favorite sport, and whenever I can work it into a lecture, I want to. And the 1930s make it pretty easy to, as I want to introduce you to Lou Gehrig. Lou Gehrig played first base for the New York Yankees from 1923 through 1939. He was a lifetime .340 hitter. That's going to get you in the Hall of Fame anyway, but he was known as a durable player. They also called him the Iron Horse. The Iron Horse was actually a reference to the old train days. A locomotive was known as an Iron Horse, but it seemed like Lou Gehrig was an Iron Horse also. He played, get this, 2,130 consecutive games without taking a day off, without ever having a day for an injury. That is back-to-back, season after season. The record held all the way up until my lifetime when Cal Ripken broke it in 1995, and that's a record that probably won't ever be broken. Nobody's even close and nobody's even trying today. Lou Gehrig, an absolute star. He was a great, just reliable, everyday, like .340 is a great batting average, and then to do it for all of those years, for 2,190 games in a row, amazing. But that suddenly his play changed in 1939. He suddenly seemed to lose all of his coordination for hitting. It's not unusual for, like a player in the field to see their skills kind of decline over time. Their batting usually stays strong a little bit longer, but even that kind of begins to decline over time. That's not unusual in baseball. But what happened with Gehrig in 39 almost seemed like a switch, like it was a different player that walked out there. He just couldn't swing the bat anymore. His coordination was gone. He couldn't hit. He ran terribly. When the stadium announcer in 1939 announced that Gehrig would not appear in a game and would break his streak, the stadium announcer announces that the Yankees fans gave him a standing ovation. They'd watched their hero struggle, and to see him finally get a break was amazing. Doctors had diagnosed him with a new disease, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, ALS. It's also known today as Lou Gehrig's disease. It took him out of the game. Lou Gehrig would also go on, and his name and his legacy would be used to advance medical research for ALS and other types of degenerative diseases, and do amazing work in the medical world from there. The 1930s have such a fascinating culture. It's one of my favorite eras in American history. The 1930s don't get solved by the New Deal. They don't get solved by the Second New Deal. What ends up pulling out America from the throes of the Great Depression is the change in the situation that's about to come about. And it's a story I can't wait to tell you about. Make sure you like and subscribe. God bless you.